Welcome, everyone, to the last session in our mental well-being. And today, Dr. Watson is going to be talking to us about something that is so important and impacts so many of us, and that's trauma, how it applies to all of us, and how we can overcome its impacts. So with no further delay, I will turn it over to Dr. Watson. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for being here. It's lovely to see so many people online, and also to anyone who's watching this after. Thank you for participating. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. And here we go. Great, beautiful. So the topic of trauma is something that I'm very passionate about. It's very near and dear to my heart because it is something that in my work as a psychologist and with young people, I see how much all of the things that happen to us when we're little impact us. And also from my own personal experience, the more I look at the layers of the ways that I show up in the world, the ways that I interact, the reactions that I have, all of those things can be traced back to things that I learned when I was little, and that's true of all of us. And so what we're going to look at today is just what trauma is, how it actually does impact us. And we're also really going to dive into the fact that it's not all bad. And I think that's a really important place for us to start, because usually when we hear the word trauma, we think of something really, really negative and really, really awful. And so it can be kind of scary as an educator to think, well, how am I supposed to support students with trauma? Because it is such this big psychological kind of heavy experience. And of course, some trauma is very heavy and intense. But what we're going to look at now is sort of a general overview of understanding it through the lens of every single thing that happens to us can have a traumatic influence. And that also means that every single thing that happens to us, we can move through and we can use it as a way to transform in a really positive way. So that's kind of the overview of what we're going to do. I'm going to get you to go through some reflection practices like I always do, because if you can make this personal and help apply this in your own mind to your own experiences, that will really help you in your interactions with students, and also hopefully in your own life, in your interactions with your family, friends, colleagues, all of those things. So diving in, the first big question that we want to tackle, of course, is what is trauma? What exactly are we talking about when we say trauma? Now, there are lots of different definitions of trauma out there, and there are some psychologists that would define trauma in a certain way. I am using a very broad definition of trauma because that's what I believe is the most useful definition to work with when you're interacting with students, especially in a school-based setting, is understanding the wide implications of it. So when you really boil it down in terms of what trauma is, it's any experience where our needs are not met. That is the first crucial part of trauma. And so that could be something really sudden and scary that happens. It could also be something very subtle, something about our environment or our family life or our friendships. It really could be anything. And the reason it's helpful to look at it that way is because when we think about trauma, the thing that's important about it is how it impacts us. That's the only thing that's important about it. So if we don't look at the way everything impacts us and we try to look at a really narrow definition of trauma, then we're missing all of the great ways that we can use this insight about trauma to help our interactions with students. So anytime our needs are not met. Now, what does that mean? What is a need? So there are needs, of course, for safety and security. So this is kind of a lot of the classic things we think of with trauma. If we've been hurt in some way, that of course is traumatic. Our need to be safe and secure, if that is violated, that is a situation of trauma. Now, we also have needs for things like love and connection. So we can have a traumatic experience if, for example, we have a parent that is disconnected or doesn't show us a lot of love or doesn't connect to us in the way that we feel like we need to be connected to. That is an example of something that can be traumatic. Also, if we move to a new place and all of a sudden we don't have any friends and we're lacking connection in our environment, that could be one of our needs not being met. And the thing to remember with all of these needs is that everyone is unique and different. So we can never come in and know for certain what are all of the exact needs that a child has, and therefore what are the things that they're lacking, because we never know that. That's really internal. And one of the hardest things in families as well, which is that parents and children can have different needs. So a parent might have a certain need for love and connection that is very different than their child. So the parent might feel that they really need time together with their child, and that helps them feel love and connection because that's what they do with everyone in their life. As long as they have time together, they feel really loved and connected. Whereas their child might be someone that needs a lot of physical touch, for just because that's the way they're wired. That's the way that resonates with them in terms of how to get that need met. So you might have heard things like the 5 love languages, those kinds of things. We're all different in terms of our needs. And so if you imagine a parent with one type of need for love and connection and their child has a different type of love and connection, there could be a lot of love there, a really wonderful home life, but that need is just getting a little bit crossed, and so that can have a traumatic impact on a child. So it's not necessarily that it's a terrible home environment or something major and awful happens. It can be these very subtle things. And it's important when we're thinking about that again, it's not all bad. It doesn't mean that this is terrible parenting. It doesn't mean that this is a really bad outcome for this child. It's just the acknowledgement that all of these things will have an impact. And so when you think of it this way, there's really no way for any parent to raise a child without some layer of traumatic impacts, because we're human and life is hard and not every single need is going to be met in every situation. So again, remembering this is just the understanding of it. It's not about assigning blame or, insinuating that all of these things are terrible. It's just the recognition. These things will have an impact. So another need is for independence and agency. So this is something that you can often see happening with teenagers and parents. Teenagers really feeling the need and wanting to have a lot of independence. And sometimes that can feel really challenging for them if their parents are not at that same level and want to have a more controlled environment for them. Again, doesn't necessarily, that could be a very subtle impact for them, but it will impact the way that they see the world. The extreme version of that is if they really have no independence as a young child. If there's a very, very anxious parent and the parent can't let the child out of their sight, doesn't want them to go off and explore things on their own because it makes the parent really anxious, that would be a bigger impact if it's sort of happening all the time. So that's another version of needs. And then another need is our need for growth and finding purpose. And so a lot of times, this is something that I see happening more and more in the world, is that kids, the way our society is set up, we're not really set up to help kids see their own value and their own purpose and their own sort of potential for growth. We kind of try to fit kids into other things. Like we don't have kids doing a lot of purposeful work in the community anymore. We don't really have a society that's set up that way. Not too long ago, kids would be an active member of society. They would be doing tasks for people in their community. But the way our world is set up is that they're sort of doing leisure, and then maybe they're doing tasks at home, but they don't really contribute in a lot of ways. And so that's why in schools, we often have things set up like leadership, or volunteering or things like that, which is really powerful and helpful. But if any young person And also, this is true for us as adults. If we don't feel like we're growing or having a sense of purpose, that can have a traumatic impact. And this is one of the things that can lead to things like depression and anxiety and apathy and all of those things. We'll get into the impacts in a second, but it's important to remember that that is also a need. And if that need is not met, it's going to impact us. If our life is one that doesn't have growth and purpose in it, that's going to have an impact. So, one of the factors of trauma is that in some way our needs are not met. Another factor is that we're not supported with this challenge. And this is important because we can go through all of, lots and lots of different challenges, lots of different things that are very hard, scary, confronting, difficult. And if we're supported with that challenge as we go through it, so we have someone we can talk to about it, we can process our feelings, we are able, someone can help assist us deal with this challenge, then it's not going to have a traumatic impact. So it's great to face challenges. It's fantastic when kids go through these challenges where they don't quite have what they need and then they have to figure out how to get what they need. That's a very important learning. And when you look at developmental psychology, you will see, there are certain ages and stages where, for example, independence and agency is something that every child has to start to reckon with. I don't have enough of it. How do I navigate it? This is that, we hear of the terrible twos, kids that are, pushing back against authority, those kinds of things. So it's not the challenge and not having our needs met that is the only factor in the equation. Is if we're facing that challenge, but we don't have the adequate support that we need. And again, what we need is going to be individual. So this is also tricky. Some kids will need a psychologist to help them through one of these challenges. Other kids just need a friend. Other kids need, something really physical where they can work through this, whatever it is, might be totally unique. But basically, if our need is not met and we're not supported, that will result in a traumatic impact. And the other thing to kind of keep in mind when we're thinking about trauma is that there's a difference between simple trauma and complex trauma. So simple trauma is when something happens that's hard and that's the end of the story. So, for example, when I was little, I moved towns. That was an example of a simple trauma. So it was challenging because I didn't have the love and connection that I had when I was at home. In my first town, I moved from a very, very, very small town to a slightly bigger town about an hour away in BC. But so I didn't have the sort of network that I had. And, like a lot of us, our parents back then in the 80s for me did not really know how to provide support around that. So they didn't really talk to me about it. And so for me, that was a simple trauma, hard experience, had to figure out how to make new friends, felt sort of isolated. We lost our cat in the move. That was really hard for me. So there was a loss, but it was a clean loss in the sense that it was just what it was. There was no mixed emotions around it. It was just a hard thing to go through. But a complex trauma is one where there's many, many layers. So when we have a complicated relationship with someone and then we lose them, that is a challenging, multi-layered experience. So when my mom moved away when I was 16, that was very complex. It wasn't a clean, oh, I just miss her like I missed my friends when I moved. It was, I miss her, but I'm mad at her. But I also didn't like being around her a lot of the time because I was a 16-year-old girl. So in some ways I feel freer, but then I feel guilty about that. All of those things are wrapped up. And so you'll often see when it comes to like the loss of a loved one, if someone passes away, usually there's complexity, if there was complexity in the relationship. With really young kids, usually a loss is simple. I lost my parent. I loved my parent. I needed my parent. I don't have my parent anymore. Whereas as kids get older, they start to have a more complex relationship with that person. And so that becomes more complex. So it's really, is it one thing or one relationship to that thing that I have? Or is it multi-layered and there's lots of different feelings that I have around it? Losing a friend to suicide, for example, is always complex because you're always going to feel guilt around it, even though it's never anyone else's fault. But you're always going to have that layer of, should I have done something different? That kind of questioning. So this is another piece of it. And so there's a lot of really simple trauma, like losing something we care about. That's a simple piece. Losing a pet, usually very simple because we just purely care about our pets. It's one of the places we have the most unconditional love usually. And that's just a simple, sad challenge. And so when it's complex, it just has more layers. So it becomes a little bit, the ripple effect is also more complex. So that's sort of in a nutshell what trauma is. Any experience where our needs aren't met, where we're not supported with the challenge, can be simple, can be complex. Now, in order to kind of just reflect on this, I want you to see if you can think of an example. You can either think of yourself or you can think of your students or someone else if you want to. It is great to be able to do this reflection for yourself because then it helps you kind of tune into it a little bit. But you can absolutely think of a student if that would be more useful. But I want you to just take a few minutes to note down your response to some of these questions. So I want you to think of a situation that happened in your life that you think might fall under those categories. So it could be something that happened suddenly. It could also be something a little bit more subtle. And I'll use a subtle example as I go through this to give you an example of that too. But for me, something that I know had a traumatic impact on me is having an older brother. And he didn't, I don't think, I mean, he was kind of mean to me sometimes, but it was not it wasn't one event. It wasn't like he, just beat me up or something. I think he might have beat me up when I was really little, but he didn't do something really intense to me. But there's just this consistency of someone that's older that I looked up to that kind of was annoyed with me a lot of the time. And that was really, really, really good at everything. So that's not an event, but it was an experience that was happening kind of all the time in my life. That was my reality. So see if you can identify either something subtle like that, like a pattern that was happening in your family, or something that happened. You moved, you lost something you care about, something like that. See if you can identify that. The next piece is what need was not met. So again, just see if you can think of this for yourself. There's no right or wrong answers here. So for me, having this older brother, and that sort of was always better and was always kind of dumping on me a little bit, I would say my need for self-esteem was not met. Now, I know that wasn't in the list I gave you. I gave you some general lists. So you can make up whatever you think, what did I need that I wasn't getting met? Because I think there was something around always seeing someone that was better. That was a piece that I didn't see myself as a really great person, I guess is how it was. I always saw myself as less than. So that was sort of around self-esteem. You could also call that some independence and agency because he was always kind of telling me what to do. So I think that played a role, not really getting that feeling like I could do things on my own. Could fall under that category. So see if you can identify what need was not met by this hard experience that you went through. The next piece, what support was not received? Remember, really important. So you might have received some support around it, but if you can still identify it and remember it, and sometimes even when we can't, a lot of the times even when we can't identify and remember it, these things will have an impact. And there will be a certain support that we didn't receive. So for me, when I think about that experience, what I probably needed was somebody to talk to me about it, to help me identify, oh, you feel this way because this is what you're seeing every day. And even just pointing out to me, he's older than you. Of course he's going to know more than you. When you're little, you don't get that. So the support I received is I just needed someone to reframe things for me. I think that would have really made a difference. I don't think would have internalized it so much if that was the case. So if you can identify for yourself what support was not received, what would have really helped in that situation. And then was it simple or complex? This just helps in the reflection of it. So for me, I think this was probably pretty complex because I absolutely idolized my brother. And he is an amazing person. He still is. He's phenomenal and he has so many great qualities. And then, I got the brunt of, the annoyance. I was the one he was annoyed at. And so it was complex because I couldn't really get mad at him because I liked him so much. I sort of internalized it. So it was a bit messy in that way. So see if you can identify for yourself, was this just a clean, simple thing, or do you think there was layers to it? Okay, so that reflection, doing it for yourself is really helpful because if you can identify things in your own life, this will really help you start to see them and notice them with your students. And so when you are thinking about your students and even your colleagues or staff members, what you really want to think about is not has trauma happened for them, but what trauma has happened for them. Because every single person will have an experience where their needs aren't met, where they didn't quite have the support that they needed, and that will impact them. And again, this is not to be doomsday about it or to make it seem like every child is, not gonna have these terrible impacts, because they're not always terrible, but it is the recognition. We're human and humans are imprinted by things that happen to us. And so when hard things happen, it shapes how we see things and how we react. And that's the next piece that we're going to look at. But starting with that question of, I wonder what has happened in their life, rather than are they in the category of those that are traumatized or the category of those that are not traumatized, because that category actually doesn't exist. We are all impacted by some things at some point. Okay, so the next piece when we're looking at this is, what are the impacts? So we will have impacts in our thoughts and perspective. So if we go back to that experience of me with my older brother, I started to think that I wasn't good enough. I started to think that, that I wouldn't be able to do things as well as other people. So my perspective of the world changed. For other things, when I think about my mom leaving, that changed my thoughts in terms of, relationships, and people will leave me, things don't last forever, those kinds of thoughts. So again, our thoughts usually turn to a negative when we've experienced something hard, because our brain is just coming to a logical conclusion. Oh, something scary happened. The world is probably scary. I'm going to start anticipating scary things. So it changes the way we think because we have a survival instinct. It also changes our emotions and our physical sensations. So, for example, I experienced some really scary things when I was younger. I've mentioned them before, but that scary, scary trauma brings up a physical, like I have my body turns on, it sort of gets wired, gets really activated by physical anxiety pretty easily. So because I had a lot of fear in my early life, I actually physically feel fear in a really intense way, in a way that is more intense than people that haven't gone through that. So physical sensations sometimes play a role with emotions. And then our emotions change because when we go through something hard and we have these difficult emotions that we don't know what to deal with, we start to kind of fear our emotions. We start to not know what to do with our emotions. Sometimes our emotions start getting more intense, or we start blocking them out because we don't want to deal with them. It all is different for each person, but we always kind of have an emotional impact. When something as hard has happened and we don't have the support, our emotions get kind of blocked in some way. And we start to have different emotional reactions. And then, of course, how we actually physically react. So when we're feeling things, we're having a funky relationship with our feelings, our thoughts are changing, we are going to react differently. So when you think about any behavior that you see students do, or even that you do yourself, that is hurting someone else or hurting themselves, that's always going to be a trauma reaction. Because as humans, we are designed to survive, and we're designed to survive together with others. That's what the basis of how we've existed for this long. So if we're harming ourselves or others, that is counterintuitive to survival. So that means we're in a reaction. We're not thinking clearly. We're clouded by our perspective, we're clouded by our emotions, and we're reacting from that place. So if we're yelling at someone, if we're taking someone's things, if we're being cruel, if we're self-harming, if we're getting into an addictive pattern, like all the things that we've sort of mentioned over the course of this series, underneath all of them is going to be some sort of traumatic experience. And then from those reactions, we will have developed patterns. So do we internalize by doing things like I did with my brother, thinking that I'm the problem, trying to bury our emotions? Or do we externalize by getting angry and hurting other people? We develop a pattern based on our trauma reactions. And the pattern really is the only problem, because if something hard happens and we have a negative thought about it and we have a difficult emotion about it and we react, but then we left it there and we moved on to the next situation and had a fresh response to a different situation, that would be fine. But when something hard happens and we have a traumatic reaction, we keep the pattern going. This is basically, in essence, why trauma is so hard, is that a child who is spoken to in a demeaning way by a parent will internalize this pattern, and then the next, when they're at school, for example, they will keep thinking negative thoughts about themselves even when someone's being kind. They'll assume that person's not being kind because that's what they're used to. We're going to get into this in a second, but the pattern is the problem. They will bring that traumatic situation into the new situation, and that's why relationships can get so funky and why we can have such weird reactions that don't really make a lot of sense. So the pattern is really the challenge. So just a quick reflection on that. See if you can identify with that situation you were thinking about before. What were the thoughts? How did your thoughts change? Did you start thinking negative things about yourself, about other people? What were your emotions? What did it feel like for you? Did you develop any different emotions around it? I definitely developed a pattern of emotional suppression in relation to kind of my dynamic with my brother and some other things. But then with my mom leaving, I developed a pattern of really having big emotional outbursts because I couldn't keep it locked down anymore. So what was that for you? What were the emotions? What were the physical sensations? And then how did you react? So one of the ways I reacted was to become a people pleaser and a perfectionist and try to be as good as my brother, right? That's one of the ways we do it. Sometimes we will go the other way and we will say, I'm not going to try at all because this is just too hard. I'm never going to make it. So noticing what are the reactions and then what are the patterns? How did that then lead to different patterns in your life? So for me, the people pleasing really led to internalizing of my own emotions. And then my relationship with my mom also led to externalizing. But for me, that usually only comes out in close relationships because that's where that really hard pattern happened. So I take it out on the people closest to me, and then with everyone else, I suppress. That's a pretty common way that we react. So just noticing what are the impacts. And so again, the more you can reflect on this yourself, the more you will start to notice these patterns in your students. Okay, now why are there differences in how trauma impacts different people? This is a really important question. So if you think of our mind a little bit like a water glass, and the part way up, it's filled at the bottom with our biology. So our cup already has a certain level of water, and our biology is just what runs in our family. So is there patterns of anxiety and depression in our family? Have our parents experienced trauma? Because that becomes imprinted in the way that they're thinking and feeling, and that gets passed on in their biology. So what do we get born into the world with? That fills up our cup a certain amount. And then what are the early life traumas that we experience? That fills up our cup another amount. So what are the things that happened when we were really little? What were the family patterns? What were the hard things that happened when we were so little that they shape the way we see things, but we don't necessarily think of them in our day-to-day life, but when we're little, our brain is forming, our view of the world is forming. So things that happen in sort of our first 5 years of life really shape the way we see everything. So that fills up our cup a certain amount. And then we have on top of that, whatever the next trauma, the current stressors are. So this is why some people can go through something so intensely traumatic, but their cup was pretty empty. They didn't have a lot of biological precursors. They didn't have a lot of early life trauma. So when you fill up their cup with a whole bunch, it doesn't spill over. They sort of don't have a lot of impacts from it. But someone else that has a lot of biological precursors, a lot of early life trauma, any sort of little thing that's hard will spill the cup over. So this is a really helpful thing to keep in mind. And this is why we can't ever judge anyone for their reaction or whether something's hard or not for them. It's always going to be a combination of these pieces. And also keeping in mind, sometimes trauma reactions are about emotional suppression. So just because someone is not reacting to something doesn't mean that they're fine. It could mean that they're fine. It could also mean that they've actually just got a really strong pattern of suppressing. And so they're just suppressing this as well. So, but that's why there can be differences, such a variety of differences in how people respond and are impacted by trauma. Okay, so this is where it can get really interesting in terms of the ripple effect of trauma. And this is an important concept to understand. So it's called repetition compulsion. And all it means is that we repeat patterns. So whatever experience we've had that's traumatic, we actually repeat it in different places in our lives. So for example, a child who has an abusive parent is much more likely to get into a relationship with an abusive partner than someone who does not have an abusive parent. Now, that doesn't mean that that has to be the case. Absolutely not. But it's just more likely. The same thing goes, because I had that experience with my older brother, it's more likely that I'm drawn to situations where I feel like where there's people that are kind of, I feel like are superior to me. Now, again, that's not necessarily even a good or a bad thing, but it's more likely because that's what I experienced. And there's two reasons why we do that. On the one hand, because it feels normal. So this is, whatever feels normal to us, we repeat. This is also why, in a really sad way, kids who are sexually abused often go on to become very sexualized. And so they end up actually getting abused more because they are putting themselves in a situation that leads to that. And this is in no way is that blaming, in no way is that their fault. It's just natural. It's natural when you've gone through something to then repeat it because that's what feels normal for you. And this is unconscious. So this is a really good thing to remember when you see kids do things that are provocative in a really unhelpful way, or they're perpetuating violence, or they're getting chronically bullied, and you can see them doing things that essentially make it worse for them. It's not intentional. It's because in their framework, in their thought pattern, in the way they see the world, that is normal. And so they unconsciously repeat that. But there's a really cool flip side, which is that we also repeat patterns because we want to transform. And this is so cool because when you think of a pattern, let's talk about the domestic violence one. If you've been mistreated by a parent, the only way you can resolve that and change what's happening in your brain is if you are in a similar situation, but you respond differently. So, for example, if a parent is always yelling at you, you start to develop a framework in your mind that people are always cruel and people can't be trusted. And you walk around your life thinking that way. Now, you're never going to change your thoughts on that because it's so embedded unless you come across another person who also yells at you, but you somehow figure out how to navigate that relationship. Because remember, things that happen when we're little, we have no power. There's nothing we could do if a parent is yelling at us. But if maybe a partner is yelling at us, or a boss is yelling at us, or a friend is yelling at us, and we figure out a way to have a bit more power in the situation, and maybe we learn how to call them on it and confront them about it, or express how it makes us feel, or in some way have a different dynamic with someone that's doing that same thing, all of a sudden we feel differently about someone yelling at us, which means we literally retroactively heal our trauma, because all of a sudden now our memory of that early event isn't I was yelled at and that means I'm a terrible person and people can't be trusted. We have a different framework for understanding someone yelling. We go, when people yell at me, oh, it's because things are going on for them, but I can actually protect myself in that situation. It doesn't actually lead to me feeling like I'm not good enough or that people can't be trusted. Now I have a different understanding of that experience. And so repeating a pattern is a way of resolving it. And this is so cool and so interesting and really helpful when you're thinking about your own life. If you're like me, you do things a lot of times before you learn the lesson. That's okay. That's really normal. And also when you see your students, when they're drawn to doing things that are unhelpful, we want to have the empathy and compassion of recognizing, okay, this is because they've gone through, these things. It's normal for them. But also we want to start thinking about the fact that, this is part of their healing. And that's a really good framework to have. So quick reflection. Thinking about a family relationship pattern is a great way to sort of reflect on this. So thinking about what is a dynamic you had with a parent and how might you repeat that? So for example, for me with my brother, actually, let's do my dad. Let's bring my dad into the mix here. So my dad, when I think of, so the way you can do this reflection is think of a family member, think of how you felt around that family member. So when I think of my dad, I think of calm, peaceful, and distant. That's probably the vibe I get with my dad. He's very even keeled, but also pretty emotionally distant. So that's how I felt with him, I think, as a kid a lot. Now, how do I repeat that feeling? What other dynamics do I get into where I feel that way? And when I think about it, I've definitely dated someone that had that feeling, that similar feeling. I've definitely had friendships that had that similar feeling. And so just noticing that, oh, okay, that's when I am drawn in a certain way to people, specifically men who are, maybe very calm, but also maybe very distant. That's one thing that I repeat. I also repeat patterns with my mom, which is the opposite, but noticing what other situations am I in that I feel the same way? That's the indication. So when you see a student who's getting picked on a lot, for example, and always seems to make friends with people that are mean to them, we go, oh, okay. I wonder they're repeating something. I wonder somebody else in their life probably makes them feel the same way, and noticing that. Okay. So the flip side, this is the great piece about it. I don't know how many of you like Leonard Cohen. I love Leonard Cohen, but this quote is so powerful here. This quote of, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. This is what we want to think of when we're thinking about trauma. It's through these cracks, through these challenges that we start to transform. So when we think about this, sorry, I did that twice. When we think about this, when something is hard, and we're going through a challenge and we're impacted by trauma, we can think of that as a breakdown. This is why we don't want to re-trigger kids. We don't want kids to feel the impact of their trauma because we're so scared about the breakdown. But the breakthrough is how we process these things. If we see a challenge and then we move towards it and we process it and we figure it out, we actually get to a deeper level of wisdom. And so that's that next piece. We get more wisdom and growth when we go through something hard and we move through it. We also can find a sense of purpose when we do this. So if you look at the world and you look at people that are doing really amazing things, usually their sense of purpose comes from a traumatic experience because they go through something really, really hard. And I'm no different from this. We go through something really, really hard. We resolve it and process it. And it was really hard and really intense. And we learn a lot from it. Then all of a sudden we realize we have all this wisdom and we have this sense of, I want to give this back now. I want to share this because I don't want anyone to have to suffer like I did. This is a really common pattern when we go through something hard. And so trauma usually is a catalyst for incredible things. You might even notice that in your own life. Maybe one of the reasons you got into teaching has something to do with something hard you experienced. Maybe something hard at school, maybe something hard with learning, maybe not. Again, that doesn't always end up being the case, but oftentimes there's this drive to give back as a result of going through something hard. And so when we think about how we process trauma, that's the big question. How do we get there? How do we move to that growth? The most important thing is we notice the pattern. This is how we climb that mountain. Just notice what's happening. Find support. Notice I'm impacted this. What do I need right now? That could be everything from getting regular therapy to asking someone for a hug right then. Whatever it is, notice I'm impacted. Find support. Feel the emotion. Let yourself identify, how do I feel in this situation? How has it impacted me? Don't skip over that, right? This is the part that we often skip over, but really let yourself feel, ooh, that really scared me. Or, that comment that student made me feel really insecure and shaky. Whatever it is, notice it. What is the emotion? That is the pathway. See the flip side. So let yourself feel it. Don't gloss over that, but then see the flip side of, what wisdom can I gain here? What's the growth? How can this experience actually serve me in my life? No matter how hard or awful it is, there's always a flip side. But if we go straight to the flip side without feeling the emotion, we will then be minimizing it. So we have to acknowledge, this is hard. This is intense. I need some support around this. And then we can move on to the flip side of, how am I going to grow from this experience? And then when we see that, just make one tiny change. That's it. That's all we need to do. And I've talked about this in previous sessions. The empowerment is everything. If I see that I'm impacted, for example, by a comment someone made to me, and that was it impacted my need for love and connection in that moment, or I have to, for example, you went through COVID. Your needs were not met during COVID, no matter who you are, some level of your needs were not met. So finding support. What do you need to support yourself? Let yourself feel, what are all the things that it felt like for me to go through that? Was I scared? Was I overwhelmed? Was I frustrated? Was I lonely? Then the flip side, what am I going to gain from that? It doesn't mean it's all rose-colored glasses or we're trying to make it seem like it's positive when it's not, but there's always going to be some sort of learning. What is that learning? And then what's a tiny thing I can do to help myself, embrace that learning or take that learning on board or work with my emotions a little bit on it so it feels a little bit better. Anything that we do to move towards that flip side changes the way we're seeing it. So basically, no matter what traumatic experience we've had, whether it's recent or early life, this is the strategy. So then when it comes to students, this is how you can help them. Remembering you don't have to have an in-depth conversation about their trauma. You can say some little comments, and understanding this piece about trauma and understanding that it's not a individual category and really, really intense. It actually applies to all of us as the first place to start. But then here are some really helpful phrases that embed that learning when you're talking to students. Simply validating their feelings, empathy. I'm so sorry this is hard. So if a student has gone through something really hard and you know that, just stating that. And sometimes we can feel a bit nervous to bring something up because we think maybe the student doesn't want to talk about it. You don't have to open up the dialogue, but guaranteed if they've gone through something hard, it is on their mind, it is impacting them. And so just saying, I'm really sorry this is hard, that's it. You're not asking them to talk about it because obviously some kids will not want to talk about it, but just saying that is really, really powerful. It gives them space to start to identify it themselves. I really care about you. So just showing care and concern is really, really powerful. Sorry, that's a lawnmower going on behind me. I don't know if you can hear that. um, so saying, I really care about you, showing that care, because remembering their need is not being met. Generally speaking, we always know that need for love and connection is something that's important. Probably their need for love and connection is not being met if they're going through something hard. So just being that person, I really care about you. It's okay to feel whatever they feel. So this is where normalizing feelings, talking about, if you know that they've been through something, a loss, or they've been through something hard, just noticing, or COVID, whatever you want to talk about, it's okay to feel anxious about the future, because we've been through a lot of changes in things in the last few years. Especially older students are feeling a lot of that. We just need to normalize that. It's okay to feel anxious about being around new people. We haven't been around people. There's a period of time where we weren't around people. It's okay to feel really sad and confused if you've lost someone. So just normalizing that helps them connect a little bit more. And then noticing their strength, wisdom, power, whatever you see in them, help them identify that. I see how wise you are. You've been through a lot, and I notice how much empathy you have for other people, like helping them link. Again, sometimes you can have the full conversation of, because you went through this hard thing, you've learned this, but you can also just point it out in simple ways if you don't have time for that full conversation. So you will notice kids that have been through hard things have so much wisdom. They really do. So you can just point it out to them. Wow, you really get things on a deeper level than other kids. And I can see that, just pointing out, and that will help them start to reframe it in their minds. Again, we don't have to say exactly how they learned that. We're just noticing for them because they need that to be pointed out. And then simply, I believe in you. So really, really important, remembering that when someone's been through something traumatic, yes, it's hard. Yes, it can absolutely damage us. It can change the way we see things. It can be hard and awful. And there's always a pathway to growth. And so if we remember that we don't want to look at kids and feel, so overwhelmed, like nothing good is ever gonna come in their life because they've been through this hard thing. We don't want to have that framework. We want to always see the potential they have. So just communicating that, I believe in you. I know you're gonna get through this, and even if you're not talking about it directly, but I know that you will figure out what you want to do in your life. I know that you will get to the place you want to be. Whatever it is, communicate that that confidence in their abilities, because that's really when we're stuck and when trauma is impacting us, we lose sight of that. So these phrases, no matter what trauma your students have gone through, really, really help to just help them go through that process of feeling their emotions and seeing the flip side and really starting to help themselves. Okay, let me pause there. All right, sorry, I've gone 2 minutes over again. Thank you so much, everyone, for being a part